you and to join the University of Copenhagen community in this important lecture series, and also the important project on mediatized diasporas, which is very important. And you were very kind before to invite me and my co-author Randall Fowler from University of Maryland to contribute also an article about Arab resistance in the diaspora, with a special reference to the Egyptian whistleblower and of course the Saudi activist as part of the Journal of Arab and Muslim Media Research. So thank you so much again for this kind opportunity on all levels. I really want to start by giving more of a contextual, holistic overview of the conditions and the factors that have been impacting what we can call Arab resistance inside and outside the Arab region in the context of the post-Arab Spring and the post-COVID-19 pandemic, because there have been so many different factors and variables which have been impacting these phenomena and the way they have been really evolving recently. So I know that 4 countries that you are particularly focusing on in your own project, Mediatized Diasporas project, they are Syria and Bahrain, Tunisia, and Egypt, which are coincidentally actually 4 countries I'm working on right now and conducting research with a colleague of mine, Dr. Rasha Libieri, on this particular topic and on these 4 particular countries coincidentally. So that's a great coincidence, and I hope that we can build upon this to create some kind of further collaboration and future research projects that we can work on together with your respected center and project as well. So what really happened was 10 years ago, of course, this year, 2021, we are marking, and I will not say celebrating, because celebrating means you are happy and you are creating something which is like celebratory and joyous. And unfortunately, that is not the case with the Arab Spring uprisings, as many of us know. 10 years ago, when the Arab uprisings erupted, there was this kind of euphoria. I even refer to the term techno-euphoria. Techno-euphoria here meaning the kind of happy and joyous and festive celebration of social media and new media as potential factors or variables that can really kind of boost the momentum for activism moving forward, and can help activists, journalists, writers, opponents to move forward with their own agenda and to create some kind of resistance momentum for these regimes, and of course to boost democratization and reform in the so-called quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries. We all know that 10 years later, in the year 2021, this is not what we are witnessing or seeing on the ground. The realities now are very grim and they are very different, because we are seeing a backlash in terms of the amount of freedom and the margin of freedom which is actually allowed in many of these so-called post-Arab Spring countries. Many of them are suffering from a lot of even reversals or detours in terms of their own path for democratization and reform. We have seen the full cycle return to an even much harsher form of military dictatorship in Egypt. Of course, the civil war and the humanitarian crisis to a vast scale in Syria. We have seen, of course, Bahrain being called the crushed uprising or even the forgotten uprising, because people don't talk about it anymore. And unfortunately, it was crushed very harshly by a technologically savvy regime, as we're going to talk about that in a minute. And unfortunately, even the only country that we used to refer to before with some kind of optimism, right? And we used to talk about the Tunisian exceptionalism and Tunisia being the exception to all of this kind of detours. Unfortunately, even Tunisia is now witnessing its own backlash in terms of democratization and freedom, which is of course a very sad thing to see, because we were always proud of the Tunisian model. We even called it the exceptional Tunisian model, and that is no longer the case, unfortunately. So with all of this kind of shrinking margin of democratization and shrinking margin of freedom, a lot of the Arab activists, writers, bloggers, opponents of the regime, they found no outlet except really trying to create some form of activism and momentum in the diaspora. That led many of them to actually seek what we call self-exile, meaning they decided by their own free will, even if they were not ordered by their own regimes to do so, but they somehow created this kind of self-exile momentum in order to secure their own safety and the safety of their own families and loved ones. So that created this momentum for the process of Arab resistance in the diaspora that we have been witnessing, of course, especially with an increased rate over the last decade since the eruption of the Arab Spring uprisings. I would also add the second layer I mentioned the post-Arab Spring, but I also mentioned post-COVID-19, which is an equally very important factor and variable to bear in mind, because we are now seeing even another added layer, if you will, of repression and of backlash in terms of the amount of freedom in general and journalistic and media freedom in particular, with the new cybercrime laws which have been put in place by many of these regimes, including, of course, post-Arab Spring countries, where they actually started to curb the margin of freedom in general and the margin of freedom of expression and freedom of the press in particular, creating an even more restrictive and more repressive environment politically, socially, and of course in the mediated sphere as well. So that also started to create another even momentum for more and more activists, journalists, bloggers, writers, opponents, and others to also flee their home countries and to seek refuge and to seek some kind of safety, if you will, in the diaspora. And this is very important, of course. We can go on and on talking about these cybercrime laws. I'll just tell you briefly that they are very vague, and they are intentionally vague on purpose in order to give the regime a very wide margin of cracking down on opponents and opposition, and also cracking down on journalists and writers and bloggers if they wish to do so under very, very vague terms, like, oh, you are convicted of spreading false information or fake news, disinformation and misinformation. Okay, but they don't really clearly tell you what does it mean? What does it mean that you are spreading, fake information or basically misinformation or disinformation? These terms are left very vague on purpose in order to give the regime a wider margin of really cracking down on its own opponents, which created another momentum, another incentive for more activists to flee and seek refuge in the diaspora. So having created this kind of context, let's move on then to talk about the three specific points or aspects I would like to focus on today. The first one, of course, being the potentials, which basically means what can be the advantages, if you will, or the strong points or the potentials of having this type of activism in the diaspora. And then we'll talk about some of the limitations or the challenges or obstacles which could actually face and are facing many of these diasporic communities and many of these diasporic activists abroad. And then, of course, we'll end with some kind of future prospects and some kind of futuristic outlook on what could possibly be expected moving forward. Although I would say that it's very hard to predict a lot of things in the Arab region, unfortunately, because of, as you know, the complexity of the political, social, economic, and legal factors impacting this particular region. But we'll try to do our best here. And then, of course, we're going to open the platform for your Q&A, which I very much look forward to. But let's start first with the potentials. What are some of the most important potentials of this movement, if you will, or this kind of community, the diasporic Arab community, when it really tries to resist its own autocratic and authoritarian regimes? Of course, the most obvious and the most clear one, right, is being away from the grip of the regime, at least physically. And the reason I'm saying physically is because once we talk about the limitations, I'll start to explain some of the ways through which these regimes are still going after their own opponents, even in the virtual world. So even virtually and online, they're still, going after their own opponents in some very aggressive ways online, but at least in a physical sense, right? Like I just yesterday, a prominent Arab journalist, and I will not, of course, disclose the name, has sent me a direct message on social media saying, hello, I'm here in the US. And I said, okay, welcome. I know that you are on and off going back to Egypt and coming to the US. He said, no, this time it is permanent. I'm going to be in the US for good. And I was a little bit surprised, like, what's going on? And he said, listen, it's becoming scary. It's becoming alarming. I'm getting so many different clues and so many different tips that this is becoming more and more increasingly unsafe for me. There are messages even sent through different, regime mouthpieces, through the media, through television, through newspapers, which are making me very, very uncomfortable. So now I feel like it is much safer for me to really be in the US, until the end of my life, and I'm not deciding to go back ever. And I was like, oh my God, this is like, and this is a big figure, a big name, a well-known person in the media sphere in Egypt and also within the Arab region at large. So that's just showing you that this whole thing about, safety, my safety and the safety of my family, of course, is one of the biggest potentials of having this kind of, diasporic communities, because they want to make sure that they don't get arrested or jailed or killed in their home countries. And this is just one example among many. The other potential, of course, is the ability to actually exercise some form of activism online. A lot of my own work and scholarship has centered on the notion of cyber activism. As many of you know, that has been one of the main topics and themes and angles I have been focusing on in my own research, cyber activism in general and cyber feminism in particular, since I'm also an affiliate professor of women's studies at the University of Maryland, besides being also a professor of communication. So I've always had an interest also in gendered activism, and we're going to talk about that today for sure. But cyber activism, which is this momentum or this potential of using social media and new media in order to enact some form of democratic and political change in your own home country, right? With the shrinking margin of freedom that we have mentioned before in the post-Arab Spring and post-COVID-19 era, we are seeing less and less potential for these activists to actually enact any form of activism. Even when I wrote my second co-authored book, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, together with my co-author, Dr. Mohammed Nawawi, we had interviewed some of these political bloggers in Egypt as well as in the Arab world, the Arab region at large. And many of them were like, yes, we can do something positive. Definitely, we can enact change. We can really pave the way for revolution. They were very euphoric. That's why I talked about the term techno-euphoria or media euphoria, which characterized this phase, right? I'm an Egyptian American. So naturally, of course, like many others, there was this moment of euphoria, and we were attaching a lot of high hopes and high expectations to actually social media and new media in this process. 10 years later, what's the story now with many of these activists, bloggers, writers, journalists, right? Unfortunately, there are three different sad scenarios. Many of them stopped their activism altogether, whether online or offline. They're not really being activists either on the ground or in the real life, situation. And they're also not active on social media anymore for fear of their own safety and safety of their own families. Some of them decided to flee to the diaspora and to exercise their own activism and resistance or journalism and writing and blogging from the diaspora. And some of them decided to write about non-political issues. So they can talk about, maybe women's rights or sexual harassment in a non-political context, not necessarily pointing the fingers of blame at the regime, so to speak, and try to play it safe, as they say, in a way that tries to, help them to navigate the difficult and very constraining environment in their own home countries without really getting arrested or getting in trouble, right? So these are really sad scenarios. There are only a few who are really still active against all odds inside their own countries. And guess what? Some of these have been recently getting in trouble, and we are seeing more and more of these names, unfortunately, being arrested. So cyber activism became this important second potential for the Arab diasporic communities, the ability to actually use social media and new media in order to create some form of momentum or some form of action on the issues that they care about. And I'll give here the example from the Syrian diasporic community in particular. The Syrian diasporic community, for example, has created a lot of momentum in terms of trying to raise awareness about the plight of, the Syrian refugees. Of course, we know that there are, millions of those, right? They're really huge numbers. It's the worst humanitarian crisis in modern times, as we all know, and the scale is just massive. So not being able to exercise their own activism at home, for sure, in the midst of a civil war and a humanitarian crisis, many of them started to use social media and new media to create awareness about the plight of Syrian refugees, to create, some platforms for activism, create certain NGOs online that you can contribute to, donations, raising money, raising funds, raising awareness, donations, all of that stuff online, which is why I always raise the issue of when we use terms like clicktivism, right, and slacktivism, when we talk about things like clicktivism and slacktivism, which basically means that people are using social media and clicking, on their own social media platforms, instead of taking real action and actually doing something on the ground effectively. I always say, wait a minute, we should take this term with a grain of salt, because in some cases you don't have any option except the option of cyber activism. That's the only option you have. In the case of the Syrian diaspora, pretty much if you are, exiled from your own country, whether you're, pushed out or whether you are self-exiling yourself, you don't have a lot of options except to use cyber activism. So in this case, we have to be careful not to use terms like quote unquote clicktivism or slacktivism, because it would not be fair to describe these kinds of activities and activists as slacktivists or collectivists, because we don't have any other option except the option of using social media and using cyber activism as their only vehicles and only channels of creating some kind of momentum and enacting some form of change. So that's an important point that we should raise as well. And of course, the third important potential is reaching an international and global audience. So some of the, for example, activists I have been interviewing for some of my previous pieces of research and articles and work, some of them said, our job is threefold. We have three important functions or three important roles to play. There is the element of mobilization, trying to create some kind of momentum or some kind of mobilization in our own home countries, getting people better networked, better connected, better mobilized, better organized, even if we are not at home, but we're trying to create this kind of momentum. So this is the mobilization part. The education part, meaning raising awareness about important issues that matter, issues related to the plight of our own people and the sufferings of our own people and what they are, going through, just like I mentioned, the Syrian community. And the element, of course, of documentation. And documentation means you are trying to actually document everything which is happening on the ground and trying to bring that not just to a local audience, but in the case of resistance in the diaspora, you're talking about an international and a global borderless audience, which is very important. So that's another very important potential, that you are not just confining yourself to the national or local boundaries, you are actually now spreading your wings to an international, borderless, and transnational community, which is very important. And that's especially important when we talk about the issues of documentation and education, right? For many people, they say if it was not for Syrian activists smuggling their own videos and uploading them on YouTube, the world would have no clue. The world will have no clue what is happening in a country like Syria, for example. People would not be aware what is happening in a country like Syria had it not been for the citizen journalists and the activists and young journalists smuggling some of these videos and actually, showing them and putting them, uploading them on YouTube for the entire world, for a global international community to see. So that's an important point, because in Syria, for example, journalists have very, very little freedom, if any, and many foreign and international journalists are not even allowed to work in Syria, are not allowed to do any kind of reporting or any kind of coverage inside Syria. So therefore, the smuggling of these videos and uploading them on YouTube became almost the only way for the entire world to know what is actually happening inside Syria, for example. So all of these, of course, and the appeal to an international global community also means this is another potential, that you can get more alliances, you can get more solidarity, you can get more people who are supporting your cause, not just locally, but internationally and globally. So you get more people who are saying, yes, we have to help Syrian refugees. Let's do something about the plight of, the Bahrainis who are, treated, badly in their own country, are not given the same rights, as the Sunnis. Let's talk about, what's happening in Egypt in terms of violations of human rights, and so on. So it became really like creating also some form of international solidarity and international alliance building by raising awareness and by playing the three functions I talked about, which are mobilization, education, and documentation. You are also bringing attention globally and internationally, and you are also building alliances, and you are also building solidarity and building alliance building and solidarity building, which is very important to support your own cause moving forward. Having said all of that, just like everything else in life, there is always another side to the coin and another side to the story, unfortunately, right? So it's not all roses and it's not all beautiful. We know that for sure. We know that there are so many hardships that these activists, journalists, bloggers, and others are still facing up till this moment. And unfortunately, I think many of them will continue to also face for some time to come, unfortunately. Of course, the first and the most clear threat or challenge that they are facing is the increasing technological savviness of the regimes themselves. So when the Arab Spring uprisings erupted 10 years ago, there was a big gap between the technological savviness and preparedness of the regimes in power and the activists and the opponents, and including, of course, bloggers and journalists and others who were against the regimes, right? The regimes in the Arab world did not see it coming, as they say. The Egyptians were unprepared, the Tunisians were unprepared, the governments did not know what to do. In many cases, they panicked, and in some cases, they just started to take action that became counterproductive and even backfired, such as, for example, pulling down the kill switch and just creating some kind of internet shutdown for a whole week which became somehow disastrous in the case of Egypt, because that really created losses, to millions of dollars of losses at the time. And of course, other regimes were looking and listening and watching and learning and building their own learning curve. So the Syrians were looking at what was happening, for example, in Egypt, and what was happening in Tunisia, and looking at some of the actions that backfired, such as pulling down the kill switch and shutting down the internet for a whole week in Egypt. And they said, no, 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 we are not going to do that. We're going to become more technologically savvy and more technologically smart, and we're going to do it in a different way. We're just going to shut down the internet Thursday night and Friday, which is the time when people are more likely to go out in the street and to protest and to create some kind of momentum on the ground. We are going to be smarter in order to avoid some of the negative consequences and implications that happened, for example, in the case of Egypt. So teams are building their learning curves. Yes, the activists, the bloggers, the learning curve, but in parallel, the regimes are also building their own learning curves. They're becoming more smart and more savvy in terms of mastering technology, mastering the internet, and cracking down on their own opponents, of course, both online and offline. But when you are in the diaspora, right, you can also become the target of the regime going after you with, bots and trolls. They can troll you, they're trolling and hacking. Are hackers, right? So this army of hackers, the Syrian Electronic Army, basically started to go after. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, the connection was not very stable. So can you hear me well?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Electronic army professional actually started to after regime's opponents, start to sabotage them and start to crack down on their own websites and sabotage their own websites, after them online, to block them, to create all forms of, if you will, obstacles in terms of the activism and in terms of the actions which are taken by the regime's opponents. And of course, surprisingly enough, and ironically enough, they were praised by President Assad as like, oh my God, they are patriotic people, their country, we have to celebrate them, they're really awesome. But in reality, of course, they are an army of hackers. And that's just one example among many when we talk about the form of regimes going after their own opponents online. And that, of course, is a threat even to those in the diaspora. Of course, we cannot avoid the opportunity of not mentioning the tragic murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And of course, we are coming very close to the anniversary, unfortunately, the third anniversary of this horrific murder of this remarkable international figure. Of course, Jamal Khashoggi, as we know, he was a Saudi, activist, and he was a dissident, and he had his own views and opinions, which did not please the Saudi government. And of course, it ended up with him losing his life, as we all know, 3 years ago. So we are marking and honoring his the third anniversary of his murder, but that also tells us it's not just confined to the post-Arab Spring countries, right? So country like Saudi Arabia, which is not a post-Arab Spring country, we are still witnessing, of course, very technologically savvy regime, in this case, the Saudi regime, going after its own opponents, those who are dissidents, those who are opponents like Khashoggi and others in the diaspora. In the paper I mentioned with my co-author Randall Fowler, I hope he's also going to join us in the Q&A, of course, and make some remarks about that. There is also the Saudi, activist, Umar Abdulaziz, who is also a young activist, who is very prominent, very well known in the diaspora, and he uses social media and new media in order to spread his messages. So again, he did face cases where the regime was going after him and hacking his phone and trying to get access to his own personal information and personal data, which of course can endanger his life, just like what happened in the case of Khashoggi. You have the Egyptian whistleblower Muhammad Ali, again, someone who has been facing all sorts of threats. And these are just few examples among many. So the point here is, even though you are physically not in your home country, you are somewhere else, you can still face all kinds of consequences, such as being hacked by the regime, sabotaged. Your activities can be very much under their own surveillance. They can go after you. They can try to create all sorts of problems and issues, even in some cases reaching the point where they can endanger your own life and your own safety, as we have seen, unfortunately, in the tragic case of Jamal Khashoggi. However, this is not the only challenge or limitation. There are other challenges and limitations as well facing the activists in the diaspora, in the Arab world. Of course, we see that one of these is, for example, they don't always necessarily have the same level of even technological savviness or the same level of technological resources, right? We always talk about the digital divide or the gap between technological haves and have-nots. Some of the diasporic communities live in Western countries where they can enjoy 24/7 high-speed internet, right? And they can have some form of digital literacy and access to a lot of online resources. This is not necessarily the case in every diasporic community outside of the Arab world. Some of them live in other parts of the world where the digital divide or the lack of access to technology and to the needed resources can be a barrier to them. And digital divide is a very important point to remember, because it exists between different countries, but also within the same country. So it can be between one country and another, but it can also be inside the same country as well, between one region and another region. You cannot assume that everybody has access to high-speed internet 24/7, which is stable and reliable, and also at the same time the needed digital literacy tools. So that is another obstacle that can also impact some of these resistance communities in the diaspora if they do not have all the needed tools that they need in terms of technological savviness and digital literacy and connectivity, not to mention, of course, the scarcity in terms of other resources. They may not have all the economic or financial or logistical or infrastructural resources that they need in order to exercise their own activism effectively and productively as well. So that can create another layer of challenges and another layer of problems for these activists as well. So all of these factors combined also create another important limitation, which I would like to highlight here, as one Bahraini activist actually told me. She's an activist / journalist. She's both an activist and a journalist. And I was interviewing her for one of my research papers. And she mentioned that, yes, we try to do the best we can in the diaspora. We try to raise awareness. We try to create momentum. We try to create networking. We try to create mobilization, education, and documentation. But we also are not there physically. We are not there on the ground. There is also limitations in terms of how much and how far we can impact the real situation on the ground. That's a very important point to remember, right? So yes, you can be an activist in the diaspora. Yes, you can raise awareness. Yes, you can raise funds, if you will. You can raise money. You can create some form of solidarity, international visibility, all the stuff we talked about before, but you are not physically there. And not being physically there limits your ability to network and limits your ability to mobilize and limits your ability to actually create some kind of movement on the ground and to rally people around you and to enact change in real life, which we know is very important, because you cannot have just online activism. As we learned the lesson the hard way, as they say, from the Arab Spring uprisings. Yes, you can push a dictator from office, but figuring out what to do next is another challenge altogether. And we still have vacuums in terms of civil society in the Arab world. We still have vacuums because of lack of sufficient organization. We still have vacuums because of lack of sufficient organized opposition on the ground. All of these are real factors and real barriers and challenges impacting the kind of change that we would like to see in this part of the world. So when you are, in addition to all of that, you're also exercising your own activism, not from your home country, but from the diaspora, from abroad, you have another limitation and another problem, because you are not really in contact with people in real life, and you cannot enact change and mobilization and networking and all of that stuff when you are really far away from them. Just being online alone is important, but it's not sufficient, right? It is necessary in many cases, but it's definitely not sufficient. And it does not always create the needed spillover effect or the spillover effect that you want to see in terms of getting people organized and getting them mobilized and having action on the ground, which remains to be a very important vacuum. Up till this moment, as we speak, we are still witnessing this big vacuum, if you will, in Arab societies, and that cannot be filled only by cyber activism from the diasporic communities. It needs some kind of coordination with internal forces and internal bodies inside the Arab world, and that is very difficult to achieve when you have autocratic regimes and a high level of authoritarianism and restrictions on freedom of the press and freedom of expression in so many different ways that limits the ability to do so, and therefore it's really one vicious cycle, if you will. And to end and conclude, let's talk about the future potentials or future prospects. What could be some of the future prospects or potentials or predictions in terms of the future of Arab resistance in the diaspora? I would say that one thing I am sure about is maybe two things I'm sure about. The number one is the shift from techno-euphoria to digital authoritarianism. And I've been writing about this particular theme recently, and I continue to focus on it in my future research agenda. The shift from techno-euphoria, the moment of like, yes, social media is the end all be all, it's going to help us, it's going to do this, it's going to do this. And then now, 10 years later, we are witnessing that we cannot really change societies using, Twitter or using blogs or using Facebook or using YouTube, right? Because, these platforms have their own limitations. We all saw the blackout, of course, in Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram that stunned the whole world a few days ago, 6 or 7 hours of complete blackout. So how far and how much can you rely on these technological platforms and these social media platforms to actually create any kind of momentum when they have their own, in some cases, unstable issues. Some cases they can have also issues related to invasion of privacy and leaking information, as we saw, for example, in the case of Cambridge Analytica and others. So definitely there is now a shift from techno-euphoria, from like the end all be all, as one activist said at the beginning of the Egyptian revolution, just give people social media, just give them the internet and you will have democracy. 10 years later, we learned the hard way that this is certainly not the case. You definitely need much, much more than internet connection or internet connectivity and digital activism or cyber activism. You need to have an organized society, an organized civil society on the ground, which is not the case until this moment. And as we said before, diasporic communities cannot fill this gap all by themselves. There has to be also activism on the ground, which we cannot reach in the absence of democracy. And I often refer to this as the chicken and egg question, meaning in order to have activism and real change and socio-political transformation, you need to have a democratic environment. But to have this democratic environment, you also need all of that. You also need to have an organized society and civil society and NGOs and activism on the ground. So it creates this kind of chicken and egg question or dilemma, whereby it is really some kind of vicious cycle, and we cannot decide which has to come first, but we know for sure that they are both interconnected and interrelated. So the shift from techno-euphoria to digital authoritarianism is a reality, and definitely we are seeing that regimes are upping their games, they are polishing their skills, they're polishing their tools, they're creating new ways of cracking down on opponents, both at home and abroad, both online and offline, and that is a reality I expect to continue for a long time to come. The second reality that I'm sure about is that also the resistance to this digital authoritarianism is likely to also continue for many years to come as well, creating some form of push and pull mechanism or some form of tug of war between the regimes on one hand and their own opponents, activists, journalists, bloggers on the other hand. So yes, we have the shift from techno-euphoria to digital authoritarianism, but also in parallel, I am sure that resistance to these forces of digital authoritarianism and authoritarianism at large, the resistance will also continue, creating this push and pull mechanism and this tug of war for many years to come. And one form of this resistance will definitely be resistance in the diaspora and from Arab diasporic communities, although of course the shape and form, direction and pace of this resistance will take different forms and shapes and paces in many years to come. So I'll stop here, and I'm really happy and waiting to take your questions and to respond. And it's always the most interesting part, the Q&A and the discussion. Thank you so much.